The first house went dark on a Tuesday, and I didn't think anything of it because the Yoders never kept a lamp burning past 9. They were early people, the kind who were in bed with the sun most of the year, and I'd driven past their farm in the full dark 100 times and seen nothing but the shape of the barn against the stars. So the first night meant nothing to me. But the second house went dark the next night, and the third the night after that. And by Friday, I understood that something was moving down County Road 9 in a straight line, closing the light behind it like a man walking through a hallway, turning off switches as he goes. My name is Aldous Renner. I'm 49 years old, and I've driven the Propane route through Holmes County for 22 years, which means I know these farms the way you know the veins on the back of your own hand. I know which families run generators against the ordning and which ones still won't touch a battery. I know the Fisher place has a windmill that screams when the wind comes out of the northwest, a high, thin whine you can hear from a half-mile off if the night is quiet enough. And I knew, standing on my own porch that Friday with a mug of coffee gone cold and skinned over in my hand, that the Amish don't just go dark all at once, one house at a time, in order, like something is eating its way up the road toward mine. I want to say thank you to everyone who keeps coming back to sit with these stories, and if you're new here, welcome. Pull up a chair. If this kind of slow, grounded dread is your thing, stay with the channel and leave a comment when something gets under your skin. Now, let me tell you what I found when I finally drove down that road. The thing you have to understand about that part of Ohio is how the dark works out there. In town, dark is relative. There's always a security light on a pole, always the wash of headlights on a distant highway, always somebody's television bleeding blue through a curtain, always the orange sodium glow of the gas station on the corner that never quite switches off. Out on County Road 9, dark is a real thing with weight to it. It settles into the low places between the fields like water. The Amish farms don't fight it. When the sun goes down, the fields go to ink, and the only lights you'll see are the small yellow squares of kerosene lamps and the swinging lanterns of somebody walking out to check a cow before bed. Those lights are how you read the road at night. You learn them without knowing you've learned them. Yoders' kitchen window sits low and to the left. Miller's is higher, up in a gable, because their kitchen's on the second floor over the cold cellar. You could be half asleep behind the wheel at the end of a long route and still feel it in your gut if one of them was missing. So I felt it. That's really how it started. Not with a scream or a phone call or a shape in my headlights, just with a wrongness in a pattern I'd stopped consciously seeing years ago. The way you feel a stare that isn't there, in the dark of your own house. I live at the town end of the road, in a little frame house I bought after my wife left. A place with a gravel drive that needs regrading every spring, and a metal shed out back where I keep the tanks I'm not technically supposed to keep at home. It's a quiet spot. The Amish stretch runs south from me for about 9 miles before the pavement gives out and turns to the kind of dirt track that only the buggies in my truck ever use. A washboard road that'll rattle the fillings out of your head if you take it faster than 15. There are 11 family farms along that stretch. I knew all of them. Yoder, Miller, Troyer, 2 different Hostettlers, Beeler, Schrock, Gingerich, Bontrigger, Weaver, and at the very end, past where the county stops maintaining anything, the Kaufman place, which sat so far out that even the other families talked about them like they were a little strange for choosing it. Land was cheaper out there. The Kaufmans had always been the kind of people who did the arithmetic and lived with the answer. The Yoders were closest to me, maybe 1.5 miles down. When their light didn't come up that first Tuesday, I told myself Ezra had probably taken the family to a wedding or a funeral in another district. That happens all the time in the fall. They pack into a hired van with 3 other families, and they're gone 3 days, and the farm sits quiet as a photograph. Perfectly reasonable. I finished my supper, and I went to bed, and I didn't give it another thought. Wednesday night, the Millers were dark too. And that snagged on something. The Millers and the Yoders weren't kin, weren't in the same age group, wouldn't have been going to the same wedding 2 counties over. And the Millers had a boy, Amish, 16 or 17. One of those kids who couldn't sit still, always out in the yard after dark with a lantern doing something to a piece of equipment or checking a snare line he wasn't supposed to have. I'd never once passed that farm after 9 at night and not seen his light bobbing around the barnyard. That was the first real prickle at the back of my neck, the first cold little thread of it. But I was tired, and a man can talk himself out of almost anything when he's tired. And I did. Thursday, I drove the route in daylight, delivering, half looking for something to explain it all away. I passed the Yoder place around the noon, with a full load of tanks rattling in the bed. Nobody in the yard, nobody at the woodpile, nobody at the pump. The wash line was still up, which stopped me, because the Amish women take the wash down every single evening. It's not just habit. It's next to godliness out here. You do not leave your family's clothes hanging in the weather overnight. And the clothes on that line were stiff and gray with 2, maybe 3 days of road dust. A child's dress, small, the kind a girl of 5 or 6 would wear. 2 pairs of broad fall trousers, a woman's apron, a whole family's washing hanging dead still in the noon air, the color slowly going out of it, and not a living soul to bring it in. I slowed the truck to a crawl. I almost stopped. I want you to know that, because later I asked myself 100 times, 10,000 times, why I didn't. The honest answer is not a good one. I was a man on a schedule with 11 more stops before dark and a company that docked you for late deliveries. And there's a particular kind of politeness out here that tells you it is not your business what happens on another man's farm. That a stranger poking around uninvited is worse than a stranger who minds the road. I told myself Ezra would be back by supper. I told myself the dress was none of my concern. I put my foot down, and I drove on. And the dust settling on that little gray dress is a thing I still see when I close my eyes at night, more clearly than I see the faces of people I've loved. By Thursday night, the Troyer place was dark too. 3 houses, 3 nights, marching south down the road in perfect order like fence posts, falling one after another. That was the moment I stopped being able to explain it away. And I remember exactly where I was standing at my own kitchen window with the lights off, looking south down the black line of the road, counting the places where a light should have been and finding a gap that was 2, then almost 3 miles long now, and growing. I need to tell you about the phones, because it matters more than you'd think. The Amish out here mostly don't keep them in the house. It's a discipline thing, a way of keeping the world out, but the district had allowed a shared phone shanty about halfway down the road. A little unpainted wooden booth the size of an outhouse near the Beeler farm that a few families used for business calls and emergencies. I drove to it that Thursday night in the dark, my headlights carving 2 cones up the empty road, gravel popping under the tires. I got out, and the door of the shanty groaned on its hinge, and I picked up the receiver. And there was nothing. But not the nothing you'd expect. Not deadline silence. There was a faint hiss on it, a soft static that rose and fell, slow and even, like breathing, like the line was open to somewhere far off, and nobody was on the other end, but the somewhere itself was still there, still listening. I hung it up. My hand wasn't quite steady. I picked it up again. Same soft breathing hiss, patient as a tide. I told myself it was a downed line, a break somewhere with the wind moving the wires. And I hung it up and got back in the truck faster than a grown man ought to need to. My cell had 2 bars at the top of the road, and none at all past the phone shanty. I drove back up to where the signal was, and I tried calling the county sheriff's non-emergency line, sitting in my truck on the shoulder with the dome light on and moths batting at the windshield. It rang. It rang 11 times, I counted, and then a recording told me in a pleasant, automated voice that the mailbox was full and to try my call again later. A full voicemail box on a county sheriff's line. I didn't understand what that meant then. I understand it now. And the understanding is worse than the not understanding was. Everybody was calling. The whole county was calling that line, and every line like it. All night, all at once. And there was nobody left on the other side to empty the box. Friday morning, I turned on the little radio in my kitchen, the one I keep tuned to the AM farm station out of Worcester for the grain prices and the weather, and the swap shop segment where old men sell each other used harrows. Instead of Merle with the 7 o'clock AG report, I got a man reading the same 3 sentences over and over in a voice that had gone flat and sanded down from saying them all night long. He said residents of Holmes, Wayne, and Tuscarawas counties should remain indoors and secure all doors and windows. He said do not approach anyone showing signs of confusion, aggression, or a persistent lack of response to their name. He said if a family member becomes unresponsive and then active, do not attempt to restrain them, and secure yourself in a separate room with a solid door between you. Then it looped. Then it looped again, word for word, the same flat cadence. And on maybe the 4th loop, his voice cracked, just slightly, just for a syllable, on the word, restrain a little catch. The sound a man's voice makes when the thing he's saying has just become real to him all over again. And I reached over and turned the radio off, because a grown man's voice breaking on the county farm station, the station where they read hog prices, was more frightening to me than any of the words themselves had been. That's the thing nobody tells you about how these things start. There's no siren. There's no man in a suit on the television making it official. There's just a propane driver standing in his kitchen at 7 in the morning in his socks, holding a cold cup of coffee, listening to a stranger lose his composure on a channel that's supposed to tell you when the frost is coming, understanding all at once and all alone that the ordinary running world had quietly stopped turning sometime in the night while he slept, and that nobody had come to tell him. I did not immediately do anything smart. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where I'm a hero from the first minute is a lie, and you'd smell the lie on it. I made a fresh pot of coffee. I stood at the window and drank it. I watched my own quiet stretch of gravel and the fence lines and the empty brown fields beyond. And I tried to make the morning look normal for as long as I possibly could. The way you'll keep looking at a spot on an X-ray and telling yourself it's a shadow. Then I set the cup in the sink, and I got my keys, and I got in my truck, because I'm a man who has always dealt with problems by driving toward them rather than away. And I turned south onto County Road 9 to check on the Yoders. 2 days too late, but 2 days too late is still better than never. And because I could not stand the picture of that little gray dress hanging in the settling dust 1 hour more. The Yoder farm looked wrong before I even turned in at the gate. The gate itself told me first it was standing open, swung wide on its post. And the Amish never leave a gate that way, not ever, on account of the livestock getting into the road or the corn. A closed gate is second nature to them, closer than second nature. A man will close a gate behind himself in his sleep. As I came up the rutted lane, I could see the big barn door standing open too. One great sliding panel pushed all the way back on its rusted track. And the dark inside that doorway was the kind of dark that felt like it was looking back out at me. I stopped the truck square in the middle of the yard, and I sat there with the engine running and my window down for a good long minute, just listening, the way you'd stop at the top of the cellar stairs before you go down. No dog. That was the first thing my body understood before my head did. The Yoders had a dog, a big shaggy shepherd mix named Rufus, who would come off the porch barking his fool head off at my truck from a quarter-mile out every single time. 22 years of the same greeting. Nothing barked, no chickens either. And there's always chicken noise on a working farm, that low, constant background fussing and clucking that you stop hearing until it's gone. No pigs, no cattle sound from the barn. The whole place had the specific silence of a held breath, a silence with a shape to it. And the November wind moved through the bare trees along the lane, and that was the only sound in the whole world. I killed the engine, and the quiet got worse. I got out, and my boots on the gravel were the loudest thing for miles. I called Ezra's name, and my voice went out across that empty yard and came back to me thinner and smaller than it had left, swallowed up by all that open field. The house door was shut. When I climbed the porch steps, they gave under me with a groan, and I stopped, waiting, half expecting the door to open. It didn't. I knocked, and the sound of my knuckles on the wood was an intrusion. Too loud, a wrong thing to do in that silence, like knocking in a church. Nobody came. I tried the handle, and it turned easy in my hand. Unlocked, they never locked anything out here, and I pushed it open a few inches, and I want to tell you I threw it wide and charged in like a man in a picture. I didn't. I stood on that threshold with the door cracked, and I smelled the inside of that house before I saw one single thing of it. And the smell hit me like a hand on the chest. It was the smell of a kitchen where food had been left out 3-4 days, sweet and thick and turning, milk gone off and meat gone worse. And underneath that, threaded all through it, was another smell. Something low and organic and deeply wrong that the oldest, most animal part of my brain recognized and flinched from before the thinking part of me had any name for it at all. The kitchen was set for a meal that nobody had eaten. That's what I saw when my eyes adjusted to the dim. Plates laid out around the big table, a loaf of bread on the cutting board with a knife beside it, and the cut end gone hard and dark. A pot sitting on the cold wood stove with a gray skin dried and cracked across the top of whatever soup had been in it. Ordinary things. A family's ordinary supper, 3 or 4 days dead. And one chair was tipped over backward on the floor. One, just the one. Everything else in that room was exactly where a careful, orderly family would have left it, the towels folded, the lamp centered on the table, the boots lined up by the door smallest to largest, and one single ladder-back chair lay flat on its back on the linoleum, like somebody had stood up from it too fast to catch it, and had never once, in all the days since, come back to set it upright. I called out again, quieter this time, almost a whisper, and from somewhere deep in the house, upstairs, I thought. Toward the back, I heard a sound answer me. Not a voice. A kind of slow, dragging movement, a shifting of weight on old floorboards, the ceiling creaking above me in a slow line the way it creaks when someone very heavy or very sick is moving across the room over your head, trying to get up and not quite managing it. And then, riding under the drag of it, a low sound in the throat, a wet, clicking exhale that seemed to be reaching for a word and falling short of it, over and over, patient and mindless, a sound that no living person I have ever met in my life has made. I did not go up those stairs. I have carried a great deal of shame in my 49 years. but I have never for 1 second been ashamed of not going up the Yoders stairs. I backed out of that kitchen so slowly and so carefully that I could hear my own boot soles peel up off the linoleum one at a time, tacky in the spoiled air. And I reached behind me for the door and drew it shut against the frame with both hands, so it wouldn't so much as click. And then I was on the porch. And then I was in the yard. And I stood there in the cold November light, shaking so hard I had to put both hands flat on the warm hood of my own truck just to keep upright, breathing through my mouth so I wouldn't smell the house on my own clothes. If you've ever had a moment where your whole understanding of a safe, familiar place turned over inside of a single second, where somewhere you'd driven past 1,000 times without a thought became something with a mouth, I'd genuinely like to know where you were when it happened to you. Leave it in the comments below. It helps, more than you'd think, to know I'm not the only man who's ever stood in a yard he knew like his own hand and felt the solid ground go strange and soft underneath his boots. Here is what I understood standing in that yard, and it's the thing that shaped every single decision that came after, so I need you to hold on to it. The road went dark one house at a time, in order from north to south, because whatever this was moved on foot. At the plain speed a body walks, from one farm to the next, in the dark, when the families were home and gathered and asleep. It went to the Yoders first, because they sat closest to town, closest to wherever it had come in from. Off the highway, out of the county seat, from whatever had happened up there while we slept. Then it walked south to the Millers, then south again to the Troyers. It was 1.5 miles from my own house when it took the Yoders. And this was the part that made my knees go loose. It was moving away from me, south, down the road toward the far Kaufman place at the dead end, which meant that every family still ahead of it, every lit window still burning in the night south of the Troyer farm, was a house that had 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 nights left before the thing walking down County Road 9 arrived on its doorstep in the dark and turned it off like all the others. And it meant those families had no idea. None. They had no radio to hear the man's cracking voice. Half of them had no phone within 2 miles. They were going to sit down to supper as they always had, and read the Bible by lamplight, and blow out the lamps, and climb the stairs to bed, directly in the path of a thing that was coming for them in a dead straight line, night by night. And there was exactly one man on that whole 9-mile road who understood the pattern of it, who could see the shape of the thing from above. And it was a divorced propane driver leaning on his truck bumper in a dead man's yard, trying with everything he had not to be sick in the grass. I could have driven home. I need to be clear about that, because it's the fork the whole thing turned on. Home was north, behind the line, in the direction the thing had already come from and left. The smart, safe, purely selfish move, the move most men would make and never lose a night's sleep over, was to point my truck at town and drive and never once look in the mirror. Instead, I made myself let go of the warm hood, and I got up into the cab. And I sat for a second with both hands on the wheel. And then I turned the key, and I turned the truck south, deeper down the road, toward the houses that still had light in them, because I was the only warning any of those families were ever going to get. And a man has to be able to live inside his own skin afterward. The next lit farm south was the Beelers, about 2 miles further down, right near the phone shanty. I've known Samuel Beeler for 15 years, ever since I started running his propane for the household stove and the water heater the district lets them keep. He's a bishop in the district, a big, slow, careful man in his mid-60s with a beard gone the iron gray of old fence wire and a way of looking at you, unhurried and level. that makes you feel like he's already forgiven you for something you haven't gotten around to doing yet. If any man on that whole road could hear what I had to tell him and actually act on it, instead of arguing me into the ground, it was Samuel Beeler. I came up his lane fast, and the boil of dust behind me must have announced me a half-mile off, because he was already standing on his porch by the time I slid to a stop, with 2 of his grown sons ranged behind him in the doorway and a lit lantern in his hand, even though it was flat noon and bright, which told me something all on its own. It told me he'd been up all night with that lantern and simply hadn't set it down when the sun came, that he'd carried the night's fear right on through into the day. He knew. Not what I knew, not the shape of it, but he knew in his bones that something was badly wrong. You could read it in how still he held his big body, the way a man holds still when he's listening for a sound in the walls. "Aldous," he said, just my name. A greeting and a question folded together in the one word. I told him. Standing right there in his yard, I told him all of it. In order: the radio and the flat-voiced man, the houses going dark one after another in a straight line, the phone shanty breathing static, the Yoders' open gate and the wash on the line, and the set table and the one tip chair, and the sound I'd heard come dragging out of the dark at the top of their stairs. And I watched his face the whole time I talked. And the thing about Samuel Beeler, the thing I will always give him, is that he did not argue with me, and he did not look at me like I was a man who'd been drinking. He just listened, his whole self bent toward the listening. And when I got to the part about the sound at the top of the stairs, he closed his eyes for a moment, and his lips moved without sound. And when he opened them again, he said, "Quiet. Rachel Yoder is my wife's own cousin. There were 4 little ones in that house. The youngest is not 2 years old." "I know," I said. My voice came out rough. "I'm sorry, Samuel. I heard something moving up there, and I couldn't make myself go up. God help me, I couldn't." "No," he said, and he shook his big head slowly, and he put a hand out and rested it flat on my shoulder. "No, you should not have gone up. You did right not to go up." He said it plain, and he said it gentle, and it was the kindest thing anyone said to me that entire terrible week, because he meant it all the way down. He meant that my fear had been wisdom and not cowardice, and that I was to stop carrying it as a sin. And then he did the thing that made me hand him my trust and my life for the next 3 days, which turned out in the end to be the worst mistake I ever made. Though I could not possibly have known it, standing there in the sun with his hand on my shoulder, he turned to his sons, and he began to give orders, calm and clear and unhurried, the way a man gives orders who has run a farm and shepherded a congregation for 40 years, and has never once had to raise his voice to be obeyed. He sent the older son, Levi, a man of maybe 30 with his father's slow eyes, to hitch a horse and ride to the Schrock and Gingrich farms just south of us, and bring those families here to gather. He sent the younger one, Jonas, a lean, nervous boy of about 17, to bring in all the loose stock and lock down the animals. And then he turned back to me and he said, "You know this road better than any of us, and you have that truck. Will you drive to the far places, the Bontraggers, the Weavers, and the Kaufmans at the very end? They will not have heard a whisper of any of this, and by what you tell me, they are directly in its path. It comes to them last, but it comes." I said I would. Of course I would. Driving to the far farms was the whole reason I'd turned south in the first place. But I need you to hold on to one thing here, because it grows into something later. Samuel Beeler's farm had the phone shanty right at the head of its lane. It had a deep, stone-walled well that never ran low. It had, dug under the main house, The old settler's root cellar, the real kind. The first-generation kind. Walls of dry-laid fieldstone 2 feet thick, a floor of packed clay, cold and black and quiet as a grave, even in high summer. And it had, out behind the big bank barn where the district politely pretended not to look, a diesel generator and a bank of deep-cycle batteries that the Bealers ran to power a milk cooler because you cannot sell grade A milk that isn't chilled. And the modern world and the old one had come to certain quiet accommodations over the years about exactly that. Samuel Bealer's farm was, without anyone ever having planned it that way, without any one of us saying it out loud, the single most defensible and best supplied place on the entire 9 miles of County Road 9. He knew that. I want you to remember, when we get to the end of this, that Samuel Bealer knew that about his own farm from the very first hour, long before I did. I drove south. The pavement ran out just past the Weaver place, the way it always did. And I dropped down onto the dirt track and took it slow, the truck bucking and rattling over the washboard. And I got to all 3 of the far farms before noon had properly turned to afternoon. The Bontraggers thought I'd lost my mind until I made old Reuben a hard, wiry, argumentative man in his 50s, with a permanent squint climb up onto my running board and press his ear to the cab radio and listen for himself to the county loop. And I watched the color drain right out of his weathered face as the flat voice said, "Do not attempt to restrain them," for the 3rd time. The Weavers were already uneasy before I ever spoke. Their nearest neighbor to the north had gone quiet a day before, and they'd sent a boy who came back saying the house was empty and the door stood open. And they'd been sick with worry over it. And the Kaufmans, way out at the dead end, where the road just stopped in a stand of trees, that strange far family everyone in the district clucked about, turned out to be the readiest of all of them. The least surprised, because being thought strange in a community like that had mostly meant being the kind of people who did their own thinking and kept their own counsel and planned for hard winters. And careful people, it turns out, are the ones who live. By the late gold slant of the afternoon, I had done the thing I set out to do. I had gathered them, 29 people, counting myself, drawn from 6 different families, all of them converging by buggy and by wagon, and in the bed of my truck on Samuel Bealer's farm, the safest place on the road, the deep, cold stone cellar, the never-failing well, the hidden diesel that could keep one low lamp burning through the night, and could keep the milk cooler compressor turning, which mattered, though I had no earthly idea why it should matter, and would not learn the reason until it was far too late to unlearn it. We drove all the buggies inside the bank barn and blocked the big doors with hay wagons. We carried in every jar of canned beans and pickled beets and every side of smoked meat from 6 households. And we carried in every firearm those 6 households owned, which among the Amish meant a handful of single-shot squirrel rifles and old pump shotguns kept for groundhogs and foxes, and not one thing more. But it was more than nothing. And in the days to come, nothing was what we were all afraid of. Samuel put the youngest children and the 2 pregnant women, one of them his own daughter-in-law, Levi's wife, and the oldest and slowest folks down into the black stone cellar, where the walls held the cold and the stone would hold against a great deal else besides. And as the sun went down red and cold over County Road 9, we all stood together in the packed dirt of the barnyard, 20-some of us, our breaths smoking in the falling dark, and we watched the north. We knew where it would come from. That was the one single advantage the pattern had handed me, and I'd handed it to all of them. It was walking south, house to house, in order. And the last dark house, the northernmost light it had put out, was the Troyer place, 3 farms up the road from us. Which meant the next farm, in its straight-line path, the next lamp it would come to snuff, was the Schrock place, now empty because we'd emptied it. And then the Gingerich place, also empty. And then Samuel Beeler's, us. By my count, we had 3 nights before it walked into our barnyard out of the dark. Maybe only 2. It had never once skipped a house in all the nights I'd been able to track it, and it had never once stopped. Samuel came and stood beside me at the pasture fence rail as full night came down, both of us leaning our forearms on the cold wood, looking north up the black, empty road. "You did a right thing today, Aldous," he said low, not looking at me. "Whatever comes of it now. You warned us. You gave us the days to gather and to build. Not every man would have turned his truck south this morning, toward the thing, when north was open and safe behind him. I have known men in this life who would not have." "I keep thinking about that chair," I said. "In the Yoder kitchen, just the one, tipped over on its back. All the rest of it neat as a pin. And that one chair." He was quiet a good while, the wind moving in the dead corn stalks across the road. Then he said, "There is a thing my grandfather used to tell me when I was a boy and frightened of the dark. He said the Lord does not send the flood to drown you, Samuel. He sends the rain first, and the rain is a mercy, because it gives you the time to build the boat." He turned his head and looked at me in the last of the light. "You were our rain, I think. You gave us the days. Whatever we do with them now is on us, and not on you." I believed him. God help me. I believed every word that came out of that man's mouth. Right up until the exact moment, 3 nights later, when I finally learned what he had built with the days I'd given him. And worse, who he had built it for. The first night, nothing came. We kept a watch, 2 men to a shift, 4-hour turns, up in the loft of the big bank barn, where a hay door on the north gable gave you a clean sight line up the whole dark stretch of the road. I drew the middle watch, midnight to 4, with Levi Beeler, the older son, and we sat up there in the hay-smelling black with a pump shotgun apiece across our knees, and we didn't say much, because there wasn't much that words would help. The cold came up through the loft boards and settled into our bones, and we passed a thermos of chicory coffee back and forth between us and watched the road. Around 3 in the morning, we saw a light move on the road. Far up north, a small yellow point of it swinging low. And both of us came up off the hay onto our knees at the same instant, every hair on my body standing. But it was only a lantern, an ordinary swinging lantern, and behind it, as it came on, a shape slowly resolved out of the dark into a person. And the person, when it got close enough, was old Mrs. Troyer, alive, walking down the middle of County Road, 9 barefoot in her long white nightdress, with her lamp held up in one hand, her gray hair loose down her back, from the very farm 3 houses up that had gone dark 2 nights before. Levy made a sound and started to get up, meaning to go down to her, to call out, and I got my hand hard on his forearm and held him where he was. "Wait," I breathed. "Wait, watch her." Because I had heard that sound at the top of the Yoder stairs, and I did not trust one single thing that came walking down that road out of the dark. Not a stranger and not a friend, and not a grandmother the both of us had known for years. So we didn't call out. We watched her instead, from the black square of the hay door. And I've thanked God more than once that we did, because as she came on closer, into the edge of what the starlight would let us see, we both began to understand that something was deeply wrong with the way that old woman moved. It was too smooth. Her bare feet found the road without her ever once looking down at it, over stones and ruts that would have had a real barefoot woman picking her way and wincing. Her head was up and turning, slow, side to side, a steady sweep, Not the anxious searching a lost old woman does looking for her own house, but the flat, even scanning of an animal reading the wind for a scent. And she wasn't making for any farmhouse. She wasn't making for shelter or for warmth. She was walking the center line of that road, dead straight, due south, at exactly the plain, unhurried pace a healthy person walks, following the road the way every one of them had followed it. And it went through me like ice water, that I was looking at the thing itself, or a thing like it. This was how it traveled. It wore them. It walked their emptied bodies down the road from one farm to the next, and it did not hurry, and it did not stumble, and it did not stop. She passed the empty Schrock place, and her head turned toward the dark house, and swept on past it. She passed the empty Gingerich place, and then she came even with the head of Beeler's Lane, and she stopped. Just stopped, dead, in the middle of the road, and stood there with her lantern guttering low in her hand. And she turned her head slowly, slowly, until it was pointed directly at the barn, directly at the black square of the hay door, where Levi and I knelt, frozen and silent in the dark. And she held it there. And I would swear before God and the whole world that she could not have seen us. There was no possible way. We were two shadows inside a shadow, 40 yards off. And she looked straight at us anyway, for a long, long time. The lantern light flickered on the underside of her chin and left her eyes in black. Beside me, I could feel Levi shaking, or maybe it was me. Then, without any hurry, she raised the lantern and blew the flame out, and the road went fully black. And by the time our eyes adjusted, she was already walking on south past the lane, following the road on down, toward the far farms I had emptied that very afternoon. It didn't come for us that first night. It walked past, and that should have been a pure relief. And part of me sagged with the relief of it, but it left me kneeling in that cold loft, with a new question turning over in my gut like a stone, a question I could not shake loose as the sky went gray in the east. If it just kept walking south, past the empty Schrock and Gingerich places, past the empty Bontrager and Weaver farms, all the way to the dead end, where the empty Kaufman place stood the Kaufmans I had brought here. What would it do when the road finally ran out under its bare feet and there was not one living soul left ahead of it to find? Would it simply stop? Would it stand at the dead end in the trees forever? Or would it turn around and come back north, back up the road it had just walked, back toward the one and only farm on the entire 9 miles that still had a warm lamp burning and a barn full of breathing people? Back toward us? I put that exact question to Samuel Beeler over a breakfast of cold cornbread and coffee the next morning. And here is where the first hairline crack showed itself. Though I did not have the sense to read it as a crack at the time, I fully expected the question to trouble him the way it had troubled me to see him turn it over, worried, working out the danger of a thing coming back. Instead, a strange, settled calm came over his face, almost a relief, and he said, "Then we shall simply have to make certain that when it comes back north, it finds this farm as dark and as empty and as silent as all the others it has already passed." And he set down his coffee half drunk and went out to the barn, and Levi rose and followed him without a word. And I sat there alone at the table thinking that sounded like a sound, enough planned for a careful man, and not once, not for a second, did I stop to wonder why the bishop had already thought the whole thing through to the end. Days ahead of me, as though he'd known all along it would be coming back. The second day was the worst of the waiting, because the waiting gave us all time to think. And thinking, it turns out, is the enemy. 29 frightened people crowded onto one farm, sleeping in the hay and the cellar and the front rooms of the house. And the fear started to sour and curdle into something meaner and smaller. There were arguments over the food. over how much a body should eat when nobody knew how long the jars would have to last. Reuben Bontrager wanted to make a run north for town, argued it loud in the barnyard, said staying put to wait for a thing we knew was coming was madness, that a man's legs and a stout wagon were worth more than any stone wall. Samuel forbade it, calm and flat and final. Said the road north was the exact road the thing had come down, and none of us knew what waited up it. And Reuben did not take being forbidden well at all. You could see it working in his jaw for the rest of the day, a coal banked but not out. The Kaufmans kept to their own corner of the barn, close and quiet. And I noticed even now, even at the end of the world, that the old district's suspicion of them hadn't died just because everything else had. People still gave them a wider berth than they gave each other, still dropped their voices when a Kaufman passed. And under all of it, all day long, ran the low, steady chug of the milk cooler compressor out behind the barn, turning on the diesel generator, a mechanical heartbeat that was the only modern sound left anywhere in our shrunken world. And I found my ear coming back to it again and again, without knowing why. I asked Samuel about it that afternoon. Why keep the cooler running at all? There was no milk left to sell to anybody, no truck coming to collect it, no market at the end of any road. The generator was burning diesel we might want very badly for something else later. Might want to fill lamps or run down a battery or fuel an escape. It seemed a strange and wasteful priority for a man as careful with everything else as Samuel Beeler. He was sitting on an upturned bucket in the barn, sorting shotgun shells into a canvas feed bag by feel, counting them under his breath, and he didn't look up at me when he answered. "The cooler," he said, "is not for milk." I waited. He kept counting shells, his lips moving, the little brass casings clicking one against the next. Samuel. He stopped counting then, and he looked up at me, and there was something in his face I had not seen there before in 15 years of knowing the man, a bone-deep weariness that went all the way down to the floor of him, the look of someone carrying a thing far too heavy for one set of arms. "There's a room in the cellar," he said, slow, "under the main house, behind the wall where we've been the potatoes and the turnips. My grandfather built it, and his grandfather dug it before him. A cold room. It runs off the compressor now, off the diesel, where in the old days it ran off block ice we cut from the pond of a winter and packed in sawdust." He set the bag of shells down on the barn floor between his boots. "When the sickness came through this district in my grandfather's time, the diphtheria, it was the whole valley lost so many so fast that the men could not dig the graves quick enough, and the ground frozen hard as iron besides. So they kept them cold. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Aldous? They kept the dead cold in that room until the spring thaw, when the ground would give, so they could be buried right and proper. Some things you keep cold," he said, and he looked at me steady. "Because you are not yet finished with them. Because you are still hoping." I told myself that was just an old man's grim history lesson, a bishop's way of talking. And I let it go. And I went to haul water because water needed hauling. I would have gone right on telling myself the cold room stood empty. A relic. A story from 100 years back, except that in the blue last light of that second evening, carrying 2 full pails up from the well, I passed close by the outside cellar entrance, the slanted wooden bulkhead doors that let you down into the potato room from the yard, and I heard the compressor laboring away, and under the mechanical chug of it, faint but perfectly clear, coming from down there behind that dry stone potato wall Samuel had described to me, I heard a sound. The same sound. The slow drag of a weight shifting on old boards, the wet, patient click of a throat working to make a word and never getting there. There was something alive down in that cellar. Something kept cold and kept alive, behind the wall in the black. And it was humming along steady on the very same diesel that was keeping our one lamp lit and our one modern comfort turning. I stood over those bulkhead doors with a full pail of well water hanging dead in each hand, my arms gone to lead, my heart going like the compressor itself. And I understood in that one moment that Samuel Beeler had not spent these 3 days merely surviving, merely sheltering us. He had been keeping something, guarding it, feeding it diesel like you'd feed a fire. And I did not yet know what it was down there, or who, or why. But I knew with total certainty that it changed the whole shape of everything. And I knew that the safest place on all of County Road 9 was safe for a reason nobody had told me. I set both pails down in the dirt slow and silent so the water wouldn't slosh. And I went to find out what it was my bishop had put down in the cold behind the potato wall. I didn't get my chance that night. And looking back on it, with everything I know now, I'm certain that wasn't an accident because Samuel kept me close by him the whole rest of that evening, closer than he'd kept me any night before. He kept me talking. He kept finding me small jobs. He put me on the early watch again and paired me this time, not with the tight-lipped Levi, but with the younger boy Jonas. And it was only much later that I understood I'd watched an old, careful man quietly manage the one person on his farm who had gotten too near his secret, the way you'd manage a spooked animal, gentle and constant, never turning your back. But he made one mistake, and the mistake was Jonas, because Jonas was 17 and frightened half out of his skin, and the kind of boy who talks when the silence gets too heavy. We were up in the loft together in the small hours, watching the North Road, and the quiet had gone on a long while. And out of nothing at all, Jonas said, in a small voice, "Do you think Uncle Gideon can still hear us? Down there, I mean, under the house." I kept my eyes fixed on the road, and I kept my voice as flat and easy as I could make it. "Who's Gideon?" Jonas went rigid beside me in the hay. He'd said it without thinking, the way exhausted, terrified boys say things. And now in the silence, he'd heard himself and realized what he'd done. And I could feel him deciding whether to run from it. "Nobody," he said, too fast. "Never mind. Forget I said it. Jonas." I turned my head and looked at him, full in the dark. "Who is down in the cold room, under the house, behind that wall?" He wouldn't answer for a long time. The compressor chugged away below us, steady, patient. The cold pressed in. Finally, so quiet that I had to lean my whole body toward him to catch it, he said, "My uncle, my father's brother, Gideon Beeler. He came to us on the first night, the same night you found the Yoders. He came walking to us out of the north, out of the dark, from the Yoders side of the road. He was sick. He'd been hurt, on his arm bitten or clawed. We couldn't rightly tell. There was a wound on his forearm gone black at the edges. And Father wouldn't turn him away at the door. He's his own brother, his only living brother." Jonas swallowed hard, and I heard it. "So they carried him down and put him in the cold room. And Father says the cold slows it. He says as long as we keep Gideon cold, real cold, he stays partway himself. He can't move quick down there in the cold, and he can't hardly make a sound. And Father says it's holding him at the edge and not letting him go all the way over. And Father says when help comes, when there's soldiers, or a doctor, or a cure, we'll have kept Gideon alive long enough for it. That's what the diesel is for. That's the whole reason the cooler runs day and night. It's not the milk. It never was the milk." And there it was. The whole rotten architecture of it, laid out plain in the dark by a frightened 17-year-old boy in a hayloft. Samuel Beeler had not gathered the 6 families to this farm out of Christian charity and neighborly duty alone. He had gathered us because he needed a working farm, a full crew of hands, a supply of diesel, a store of food, bodies to haul water and stand watch and keep the whole machine running so that he could keep his infected brother alive in the cold behind a 2-foot wall of fieldstone. A brother who was, whatever the cold was doing or not doing to him, still turning, still slowly becoming the thing that walked the road. And Samuel had laid 29 of us down to sleep, every single night, 1 stone wall away from it. "Does everyone know?" I asked. My voice didn't sound like mine. "Just family," Jonas whispered. "Me and Levi and Father. You can't tell the others, Aldous. Please. Father says if the others knew, they'd force him to let Gideon go, to end it, and Father won't. He can't. He says he'd sooner die himself than be the man who lets go of the last of his brother." The boy's voice cracked, small and young in the dark. "Please don't tell them." I sat with that in the black loft, and I did the arithmetic. The terrible arithmetic that no decent man ever wants to sit down and do. But that a situation like that one forces on you, whether you've got the stomach for it or not. That thing in the cold room was infected, was, by any honest reckoning, the source. The very same disease that walked the road, up and down, on the borrowed legs of the dead. We were keeping it alive and warm-blooded, and behind a wall 100 feet from where the children slept in the hay. Every single day, the compressor kept running, was another day. We bet 29 living souls on the strength of a stone wall, and the reliability of a diesel engine, and 1 grieving old man's refusal to say goodbye. And there was worse in the arithmetic, worse than that. And it was the part that turned my stomach right over in the cold. The thing on the road was drawn to us. It had passed us the first night, but it had stopped. It had stopped dead at the head of our lane and turned its stolen head and looked for a long time straight at this barn. At the time, I told myself it saw a shape, or heard Levi shift, or simply paused the way an animal pauses. But now, sitting in the dark with what Jonas had told me, I understood it differently, and the new understanding was a horror. It hadn't stopped because it saw us. It had stopped because it felt him. Because whatever the walking thing and the cold-kept thing were to one another, now kin in the old blood and kin in the new sickness, both the one out on the road could feel the other one down in our cellar calling. Faint and cold and held back, but there. We were not just the last lit house it had happened to pass on its way south. We were the house that had what it wanted buried in the cold, under the floor. It would come back, not by chance, not by wandering, on purpose. It would walk back up 9 miles of dark road on its bare, stolen feet, and it would come straight for that cellar, for Gideon, and no amount of dark windows or held breath would turn it aside, because it wasn't hunting with its eyes. I want to ask you something honestly, before I tell you what I did next, because I've turned it over 10,000 times in the years since, and I have never once been able to set it down, settled. If it were your brother, your only brother, and the cold was the one single thing standing between him and the full horror, and a doctor or a cure might come tomorrow morning, or might never come again in this world, how long would you keep the compressor running? How many strangers' children would you lay down to sleep on the far side of that wall and gamble on the stone and tell yourself it was holding? I don't ask it to make excuses for Samuel Beeler. I ask it because in all these years I've never been fully certain I'd have done any different in his boots. And I would truly like to know, down in the comments, whether you're certain you would have. The next morning, I went to Samuel directly. I'm not a man who's ever been any good at moving behind another man's back when there's a way to move straight at him instead. I found him alone in the barn in the gray dawn, forking hay to the horses out of old habit. And I told him flat that I knew about Gideon that Jonas hadn't meant to, that it had slipped out of the boy in the dark. And I braced myself for the flare of a big man's anger. It didn't come. He set the fork down against the stall, and he seemed, if anything, to sag a little, to loosen, the way a man loosens when he can finally set down a weight he's been carrying alone, too long and in secret. "Then you know," he said. "I know it's going to come back for him, Samuel. The one on the road. It stopped and it looked right at this barn that first night. It felt him down there, under us. It'll walk this whole road back up in the dark, and it'll come straight for that cellar. And it won't matter how dark we make the windows or how still we hold, because it isn't looking with its eyes. It's coming for its brother." His face didn't change, and that was the worst of it, because a man's face changes when you tell him a new thing. And Samuel Beeler's did not change at all. He'd already known this too, long before me. "Yes," was all he said. "Then you have to let him go." I kept my voice as level as I could hold it, both hands open at my sides. "And I don't mean that. I'm not telling you to do a thing to your own brother with your own hands. I mean, move him. Take him off the farm. Load him in a wagon and carry him a mile down the road, 2 miles, and leave him there. If the thing tracks him, and you and I both believe it does, then he's a lamp we can carry away from the children. We set him a mile south of here, and the thing follows the pull of him a mile south away. And every one of these 29 people wakes up alive. And this is the moment that I will carry to my own grave, because Samuel Beeler looked at me with real love in his tired old face, real sorrow, no anger anywhere in it. And he said, "I have thought of it. Of course I have thought of it, Aldous. I have thought of nothing else for 3 nights, and I will not do it. Because if I move him out of the cold, I lose him. Out there, warm, with no compressor and no stone around him. He turns all the way before the wagon's gone a mile. And then there is no more bringing him back when the doctor comes at last. In the cold room he is held. He is kept. He is partway mine still. And as long as one single thing on this earth is keeping the last of my brother from going all the way into the dark, I will not be the man who lets go of the rope." He put his big hand on my shoulder again, the same as he had that first day in the sun. "I brought you all here to keep this farm alive, to keep the diesel turning under my brother. That is the plain truth of it, and I am not proud of it, and I will answer for it to God. But I would do it again. God forgive me, Aldous. If he set me back at the start of it, I would do the very same thing again." He'd said the quiet part out loud. He'd told me, to my face in the gray light, that we were the fuel, that 29 living people had been drawn to this farm and kept here for the express purpose of keeping one dying man kept cold behind a wall. And he said it not the way a villain says a thing, but the way a drowning man says a thing he's already made his peace with, or a man who has decided, calmly, to take the whole boat down under the water with him rather than open his hand and let go of the thing he loves. I told him I couldn't allow it. I told him, straight, that I'd tell the others, all of them, Reuben and the Weavers and the Kaufmans, everyone, and let them decide together what 29 lives were worth against one. And Samuel didn't threaten me. He didn't raise his hand or his voice. He only looked at me a long moment, and then he said, very quiet and very tired, "You warned us to save us, Aldous. That was a good thing and a brave one. But if you cut the diesel from that compressor now, or if you send the others down to do it, you will not be saving a single soul. The thing is already coming back, with him warm or with him cold. All you will be doing is killing my brother a day early, to make your own hands feel clean before it gets here. Think hard on whether that is worth the doing, before the dark comes down again." And he picked up his hay fork and turned back to the horses and left me standing there in the cold barn. And the truly awful thing, the thing that froze me right where I stood, was that he was partly right. And I no longer had the first idea which of the two of us was the one thinking straight. I spent that whole third day trying to decide, walking the fence line, watching the north road, doing and redoing the arithmetic. And while I decided, the day burned down toward evening, and the third night came on. And the third night is when everything I thought I finally understood turned over one more time underneath me. Here is the thing I had wrong, all the way through. I believed the danger was out on the road, walking south and soon to turn back north. And I believed the whole choice in front of me was the clean two-sided one. Cut the diesel and let Gideon turn, or keep it running and gamble on the wall. A simple, terrible, two-handed problem. It wasn't. Because just at dusk, as the light went out of the sky over the western fields and the compressor chugged on, and the cold came up out of the ground, Reuben Bontrager found me alone at the well, and Reuben, hard squinting argumentative Reuben, had worked out the very same secret I had, entirely on his own. From the compressor and the guarded cellar and the way the Beeler men kept their bodies between the family and the potato room. But Reuben had drawn an entirely different conclusion from the same facts. And worse than that, he'd already been busy acting on it while I stood around the fence line agonizing. "I know what's down in that hole," Reuben said, low and fast, close to my ear, his squint gone hard and bright in the last light. "A Beeler, a sick one. And I'll tell you straight, Aldous, I am not dying for a Beeler, and neither is my wife, and neither are my girls. We're going tonight, north, on foot through the fields, before that thing comes walking back for its own. And we're taking the diesel jugs from behind the barn to run the wagon lamps and trade with up the road. Everybody else can stay and burn for the bishop's dead brother, if that's what they've a mind to." He got his hand around my forearm, hard. "You've got the truck. You drive mine, and drive yours if you've got any. And we're gone and clear before moonrise. Are you in, or are you out?" And I hesitated. That's the shameful truth of it, and I won't dress it up. For a long second. Standing at that cold well with full night coming down over a road I knew had death walking on it. Taking the truck and the fuel, and a handful of the living and running hard north sounded like the only sane thing left in the whole burning world. Reuben saw the hesitation in my face and read it for a yes. And he was gone into the blue dark toward the barn to gather his wife and his girls before I'd said a single word one way or the other. What Reuben didn't understand, what he couldn't have understood, because he'd never knelt in that loft and watched old Mrs. Troyer walk the center line and blow out her lamp was the timing of the thing he'd just set in motion. That diesel behind the barn didn't only run the cold room, it ran the compressor. And the compressor was the only thing keeping Gideon cold and slow and held back at the edge. Taking the fuel jugs meant the compressor would starve and die inside a few hours. And the cold room would warm. And Gideon would turn all the way, and when Gideon turned all the way over, warm and loud and fully awake, the thing on the road would feel it, wherever it had walked to down south in the dark. Feel its brother come fully alive. And it would come. The cold room warming up was the dinner bell. Reuben Bontrager, by grabbing the diesel to save his own family, was about to ring that bell across 9 miles of dark and then be out in the open fields, on foot, north, with his wife and daughters. On the exact stretch of road the thing would come screaming back up to reach the thing it was calling to. I understood the whole shape of it in about 4 seconds flat, standing there with my hand still cold from the well rope. And I understood that I had maybe an hour, maybe a good deal less. Before Reuben's people bled the fuel and doomed everyone still on the farm, and themselves out in the open besides. That was the ticking clock, and Reuben had just started it running without the first idea what he'd done. I ran for the barn. I had to get to that diesel before Reuben did, and not out of any loyalty to Samuel or his terrible cold room, but because whoever held that fuel, held the compressor, held the cold, held how long Gideon stayed slow, held the whole terrible clock in his two hands. If the jugs went, the wall meant nothing, the stone meant nothing. All of it came down at once. I came pounding around the back corner of the barn in the last gray light, breath tearing, and I found the fuel already gone. Not Reuben. He hadn't reached it yet, either. I could hear him and his family down at the far end of the barn, arguing in tight, frightened whispers about what to carry. But the jugs were simply gone. All 6 of the 5-gallon cans, gone from the shelf where they always stood. And the big diesel drum beside them had been tipped and drained down to a thin sludge in the bottom, the ground in front of it dark and stinking and soaked with it. And the compressor, I could hear it. The compressor was already changing its note, laboring, coughing, starving on the last of the line fuel in the day tank. Somebody had been here first. Somebody had taken every drop of the diesel and drained the drum into the dirt, and I stood there in the reek of it doing the math on who in the world could possibly gain, and by draining the fuel himself, in secret, in the dark, before Reuben could ever get to it. And the only answer that came up made me go cold all over. Colder than the well water, because the one and only person on that whole farm who gained anything at all by pouring out the diesel with his own hands was Samuel. He'd chosen. That's what broke over me standing there. Faced with losing control of the fuel to Reuben, faced with me swearing I'd bring the others down on him. Samuel Beeler had made his decision alone in the dark, and he'd made it while I walked the fence line agonizing over mine. He had taken every jug of that diesel and hidden it, or worse, and he was going to let the compressor die on his own terms, in his own hour, so that no other man, not Reuben, not me, not the whole gathered lot of us, could ever take his brother from him by force. He would let Gideon turn all the way over rather than let another man's hand be the one to end it. And he'd do it now, tonight, with 29 people asleep and unknowing a single wall away, and with the fuel that could have carried half of them clear to safety poured out and soaking uselessly into the cold ground. The compressor coughed a second time, deep and wet, and stopped. The silence that came down after it was the loudest thing I've ever heard in my life. The whole farm seemed to go still and hold, the way the Yoders' yard had held. And into that new silence, up through the ground itself, from behind the potato wall in the cold room that was no longer cold, came the sound, the drag, the wet, click, but faster now, and stronger, warming and quickening, waking and rising, climbing up out of the click into a long, low moan that went higher and higher, until it was not any click or any human sound at all anymore. And from far, far down the black road to the south, faint at first, and then very much not faint, an answer came back out of the dark. A second cry from the exact direction I had sent all those emptied families that afternoon. It had heard its brother wake. It was coming back up the road, and by the speed of the sound climbing toward us, it was not walking anymore. I found Samuel in the yard, out by the slanted bulkhead doors of the cellar. He was down on his knees on the cold ground beside them, and he had a lantern lit and set on the earth close by his hand, the same lantern he'd carried since the very first night, and never once set down. And he was just kneeling there in the small circle of its light, with his head bowed low. and his big hands loose and open on his thighs, listening to his brother wake underneath him. And he did not look surprised, and he did not look afraid. He looked, if I'm honest, like a man who has walked to the end of a very long and terrible road and has finally been allowed to set his burden down in the dirt. "You took the fuel," I said. My chest was heaving. "You poured it out in the barn. You knew Reuben would run for it, and you knew I'd come to move Gideon. And you took it out of both our hands before either of us could. You'd rather let it come than let anybody but you decide." "Yes," he said, without lifting his head from his chest. "There are children in that cellar, Samuel. In the front rooms. In the hay. It's coming back up this road for him right now, and it will go through every one of them to get to him. You've killed us all to keep from being the man who has to say goodbye to his brother." And then he did lift his head, at last, and the lantern light caught his face from below, and it wasn't the face of a monster, and it wasn't the face of a madman. It was only the face of a tired, grieving old man at the end of himself. And he said the thing that I have not once been able to put down in all the years since. He said, "The children are not behind that wall, Aldous. Not one of them. I moved every last soul out of the cellar and the house at supper while you were walking the fence. All of them. Quiet, out to the farm machine shed at the bottom of the lane, the little ones, the mothers, the old folk, all of it. Everyone but me." He tipped his bowed head toward the road, toward the rising cry coming up out of the south. "And I did not hide the diesel. I poured it into the house, around the cold room, around him, and around myself." He raised the lantern up off the ground then, slow, and held it out where I could see it clearly in the dark, see how close its flame was dancing to the fuel-black, fuel-soaked boards of the bulkhead door, see the whole picture of it, entire. "When it comes for my brother," he said, "it will find the both of us, and it will find fire. And then there will be one less lamp burning on this road for it to follow home." He looked up at me, and his voice was almost gentle, almost kind. "Take the truck, Aldous. Take Reuben and his girls, and take my sons, take them. They'll fight you. But take them, and take every living soul out of that far shed, and drive north hard while it comes in for the light that I have made for it. That is what the diesel was always going to be for, in the end. Not to keep him, to finish it. I only ever needed the days that you gave us, to be sure that everybody else was clear of it first. I have gone over that one moment 10,000 times, and I still cannot tell you where, in that third day, the man turned all the way around, inside himself, from the one keeping his brother alive at any cost, under God's sky, to the one who had quietly decided to make himself the bait, the last lit lamp on a dark road, the thing that would draw the whole horror off the living and down into a fire and end the line of it there. The diesel he'd taken from us hadn't been theft to survive. It had been theft to sacrifice. And whether that made him the worst traitor on that whole 9 miles of road, the man who'd drawn 29 souls to his farm and kept them there as fuel for his own grief, or whether it made him the only true shepherd on it, the one man willing at the last to be the goat staked out in the open so the flock could run, I still cannot tell you. And I've stopped pretending to myself that I ever will. There wasn't time to argue it with him. The cry in the south had climbed into a sound I could feel in the bones of my own chest. Close now, terribly close. Coming up the road out of the dark faster than any walking thing. I turned and I ran. I got the people. I ran to the machine shed and I got them up and moving. And I got Levi and Jonas, who fought me. Levi swung on me and Jonas screamed for his father into the dark. And I dragged the both of them bodily to the truck. And I loaded the bed with Reuben's wife and his girls, and the Weavers and the Kaufmans, and every soul I could get my 2 hands on. Packed them in shoulder to shoulder, and I put the truck in gear, and I drove north up County Road 9 with the headlights switched off, so that we'd be one more piece of the dark, and nothing for it to fix on. Past the empty Gingerich place, past the empty Schrock place. And in the side mirror, as we ran, I saw the Beeler farm bloom up all at once into a hard swelling orange. Behind us, one lamp, dropped at last, set down into diesel-soaked wood, and I saw, crossing in front of that light, fast and low to the ground, and wrong, a running shape, moving toward the fire and not toward the truck, drawn straight into the lamp Samuel had made of himself. And then the black trees along the road took it, and I couldn't see any more. And I faced front, and I drove. We made town a little after midnight. 19 of us, out of the 29 that had gathered on that farm, 19, which is a number I have never once in all these years let myself round up to 20 in the retelling. Samuel stayed. Gideon stayed. And 7 others I could not reach in the dark and the running. The ones I have to make myself believe got up on their own 2 legs and got clear through the fields on their own. Because the only other thing to believe is a thing I have never been able to carry and go on living. The National Guard reached that part of Holmes County 4 days after. They'll tell you the outbreak was contained, that it never once spread past those 3 counties, that the whole thing was a clean success of the response. And maybe it was. Maybe that's even true. But I've read the maps they put out afterward, the official ones, the ones with the shaded zones showing exactly how far the sickness walked before it stopped, and County Road 9 is a hard black boundary line on every single one of them, the far southern edge of the whole event, the place where it walked to the dead end, and turned itself around, and came back, and then, the reports all say, simply and inexplicably stopped. The official finding is that the die-off in that pocket was natural, that the infected in that area lost cohesion and expired. Those are the words. It does not say why. It does not say one word about a fire at a farm at the end of a county road, or about a bishop who took the fuel his gathered neighbors needed to run and poured it out and then used it to turn himself into the last lamp burning on a dark road, so that the thing that followed the lights would have somewhere to go that was not toward the living. I still drive Propane, a different county now, further west, flat corn country where the farms are English and the yard lights burn electric and blue all night long and never once go out. And still, every single evening, when the sun drops and the farms come up lit one after another along whatever road I'm on, I catch myself counting them without ever meaning to, reading the pattern of the lights the way my body learned to read it, watching without wanting to, for the one that goes dark out of its turn. So I'll leave it with you the same way it has stayed all these years with me, unsettled and unfinished. Samuel Beeler took the fuel that could have carried more of us out alive, and he poured it out into the dark. So tell me honestly, when you've sat with it, was he the traitor who drew 29 souls to his farm and gambled every one of them on a stone wall to feed his own grief? Or was he the only one among us who understood clear-eyed from the first hour exactly what was going to have to burn before it ended? If it had been your own brother down in that cold room, tell me the truth in the comments. Would you have kept the compressor running, held to the rope, waited for a doctor who was never coming? Or would you have struck the lamp yourself? And wherever it is you're listening from tonight, a city apartment, a farmhouse, some dark, quiet county road with lamps you count in your sleep without ever once knowing you're counting them, I hope, sincerely, that every last one of your lights comes up tonight in its right and proper order. Stay with me for the next one. And do me the one favor. Keep an eye on your neighbor's windows.